The 7.62 millimeters brass casings rained down on the slick mud, scalding MacReady's wrists before they disappeared into the steaming earth. They hadn't been walking. They had been wading through the green darkness of the A Shao Valley for 3 days, the humidity of physical presence pressing the air out of their lungs. But now they were simply holding ground, or perhaps dying on it. The sound wasn't a skirmish. It was a sustained roar, the hungry, desperate chatter of the M-60. MacReady's M-60, his 23-pound mistress of destruction, named Clementine. The ambush had been perfect. One moment, the oppressive silence, thick enough to choke on. The next, the world dissolved into the shriek of incoming fire and the smell of sulfur and freshly upturned soil. Specialist Garza, the point man, simply vanished in a cloud of pink mist before anyone could even hit the dirt. MacReady didn't react. He responded. His mind had already shifted into the rhythmic processing unit required to feed the belt, hold the spade grip steady, and walk the tracers into the tree line where the muzzle flashes winked like malicious fireflies. He was laid out flat behind a rotting log, Clementine braced against the root flare, stitching a heavy line of fire across a 100-meter front. The noise was deafening, amplified by the concave pressure of the jungle, and it drowned out the whimpers of the men behind him. Sergeant Rourke, the squad leader, was already shouting commands that MacReady couldn't hear, his face a mask of primal terror and focused rage. The NVA knew they had stumbled onto something important, a major cache or staging area, because the return fire wasn't sporadic. It was layered, coordinated, and relentless. MacReady could feel the impacts against the log, the wood shuddering, splintering, sending flecks of bark into his face. He chewed through the first 100 rounds in less than 30 seconds, the recoil driving deep into his shoulder, a familiar, painful friend. He risked a glance down at Clementine's barrel. The heat waves shimmering off the perforated shroud were visible even through the thick air. He knew the NVA wouldn't assault yet. They were waiting for him to overheat, to run the mechanism dry, or worse, to run out of the heavy, glorious brass he carried, the sheer weight of which felt like salvation right now. This wasn't a reconnaissance mission anymore. It was a fixed engagement, a siege they were losing, and MacReady was the only wall still standing between 4 breathing men and utter annihilation. He lifted his head slightly, squinting through the smoke, trying to spot the exact source of the interlocking machine gun fire that kept them pinned. It sounded like a modified Soviet RPD, faster and deadlier than anything they had been trained to face in numbers. He knew, with the cold certainty of a man who has accepted his fate, that he couldn't stop shooting. If he stopped, even for a moment, the green tide would wash over them. Rourke's voice finally cut through the ringing in MacReady's ears, strained and tight as wire. "Doc's hit. RTO is down. Mac, lay down fire. We gotta pull back 20 meters. Pulling back 20 meters in this terrain felt like crossing a minefield under searchlights. MacReady nodded curtly, the sweat blinding him. He didn't bother looking at Doc Miller. The way Rourke screamed the word "hit" usually meant gone. He ripped open a fresh box of ammunition, the smell of the machine oil and clean metal strangely comforting amidst the stink of blood and decay. He refed the belt, the heavy sound of the charging handle slamming forward a brief, defiant counterpoint to the enemy's fusillade. Then he opened up again, not in short bursts, but in long, sustained arcs, sweeping the jungle floor methodically. He wasn't aiming for individual targets. He was aiming to terrorize, to suppress, to carve a pathway through the living wall they faced. The NVA realized what he was doing and shifted their focus entirely onto MacReady's position. Tracers zipped past his head, cutting the humid air with surgical precision. One round tore a chunk out of the log right beside his ear, leaving a wet, fleshy vibration in its wake. This relentless, concentrated fire gave Rourke and PFC Hayes, the youngest member of the squad, the crucial seconds they needed. MacReady heard them dragging bodies, or what remained of them, behind the small earthen ridge they were trying to reach. The earth here was soft, perpetually damp, making hasty entrenchment a miserable necessity. When he finally heard Rourke yell, "Now, go!" MacReady broke contact in a controlled panic. He didn't run. He crawled backward, dragging Clementine behind him, his massive frame shielding the exposed ammo belts. The gun was so hot now it burned through the leather gloves he wore, searing his palms. He didn't drop it. He scrambled into the shallow depression Rourke had found, sliding down into a miserable mix of mud, water, and fear. Hayes was already there, face down, dry heaving, his M-16 held limply. Rourke was checking Doc Miller, shaking his head slowly, confirming the inevitable. MacReady immediately brought the M-60 to bear, facing the tree line, ready for the countercharge. But the countercharge didn't come. Instead, the enemy fire reduced to sporadic rifle shots and then, most terrifyingly, the telltale thump of 60mm mortars being dropped into tubes. They had fixed their position, and now they were going to chew it up from above, systematically and efficiently. MacReady pressed his face into the dirt, gripping Clementine tightly, waiting for the rain of steel, knowing that every minute they survived here cost them more of the finite, precious ammunition belts. The mortars walked their way toward the shallow hollow. Whump, whump, crack. The explosions weren't enormous, but they were localized, brutal, and designed to demoralize. The smell of high explosives and scorched vegetation became overwhelming. Rourke, pale and sweating profusely, finally crawled next to MacReady. "They're dug in deep, Mac. We hit the main line. This isn't a patrol. This is a headquarters defense." He coughed, spitting out dirt. "How are we looking?" MacReady didn't need to check his inventory. The weight was enough. He usually carried 12 boxes, 1,200 rounds. 7 left, plus the one in the gun. 1 barrel swap left. The spare barrel's melting, but it'll do. 700 rounds felt like nothing compared to the volume of fire they were receiving. Hayes was weeping silently now, curled up, his youth dissolving under the relentless pressure. MacReady felt a familiar numbness settle over him. This was the duality of the war. The insane violence of the encounter followed by the paralyzing stillness of the siege. One moment, all instinct and kinetic force. The next, suspended animation, waiting for the ceiling to collapse. The jungle sounds had returned, but they were different now. Not peaceful, but predatory. The chirping insects sounded like ticking clocks, the dripping rain like footsteps. The NVA wasn't rushing them because they didn't need to. They had them boxed, the exit routes covered, and were content to let the fear and the lack of resupply do their work. Rourke tried to raise battalion on the smashed radio, getting only static and the desperate crackle of shorted wires. The RTO, Private Finn, had taken a round through the comms pack, turning the radio into a molten piece of junk and taking Finn with it. "No contact," Rourke whispered, the sound hollow. "We're alone." MacReady simply nodded. Being alone was the natural state of things out here. The only thing that mattered was the operational readiness of Clementine. He reached for his spare barrel kit. The barrel currently affixed was glowing a dull, angry orange beneath the shroud, its metal weakened, its accuracy already compromised. He stripped the gloves off, ignoring the sharp pain in his hands, and performed the change with practiced, almost religious reverence. The hot barrel hissed slightly as he dropped it into the wet earth to cool. The new barrel, cold steel, clicked securely into place. It was a temporary reprieve, a psychological victory over entropy. But the relentless shelling, though infrequent now, served as a constant reminder that their time was running out. They had to break out before nightfall, or the jungle would swallow them whole, and the NVA would pick them off piece by piece under the cloak of darkness. The long, miserable afternoon crawled by, marked only by the shifting shadows and the increasing torment of the mosquitoes, which feasted undisturbed on their exposed skin. The wetness was everywhere. Their uniforms were saturated. The ammunition boxes were floating slightly in the growing puddle at the bottom of the hollow, and the air itself felt heavy, making every breath a chore. Rourke, ever the pragmatist, forced himself and Hayes to drink from their remaining canteens, rationing the water with a grim seriousness usually reserved for gold. MacReady didn't touch his water. His thirst was secondary to the raging furnace in his chest. fueled by adrenaline and the grim knowledge of what was coming. He sat upright, his back against the muddy wall, Clementine resting across his knees. He ran his fingers over the feed tray, visualizing the path of the brass into the chamber, performing internal checks of the firing pin and the gas system. He needed to be absolutely certain she wouldn't fail when the moment came. Hayes finally spoke, his voice cracked and hollow. "Mac, if we wait for dark, maybe we can slip out the back?" MacReady shook his head without looking at him. "Back's worse. They got interlocking fields of fire set up. I saw them when I was laying down suppression. They want us to think we can sneak out that way. They've got bunkers 20 meters behind us, facing in. They'll chew us up." He paused, his gaze fixed on the dense, green foliage where the enemy lay hidden. "They want us to break, Hayes. They're waiting for us to panic and rush them, or try to run away." Rourke sighed heavily. "He's right. They're professional. This is a containment action. Mac, you burned up 4 belts in the initial contact. We're down to 3 boxes left, plus the one you're feeding. That's maybe 400 rounds of heavy coverage. We have 3 grenades and Hayes has 2 mags left in his M-16, one of which is tracer. We have to make a decision before the moon shows up." The pressure of the moment was almost unbearable, heavier than the M-60 itself. MacReady looked at Rourke, his eyes glazed over, fixed on something far away. "We go out hard, Sergeant. We don't try to sneak. We burn every round we have on the main bunker, and we force a hole through their front line. It's the only way we get clear ground to run toward the river. If we stay here, we die. If we run back, we die. If we run forward, maybe one of us makes it." The silence that followed was thick with the weight of accepting certain doom. MacReady reached into the bottom of the muddy depression and retrieved the 4 remaining boxes, stacking them carefully beside the M-60. They looked impossibly small, a pathetic guarantee against the thousands of men and rounds waiting for them. The jungle came alive again around 0400 hours, not with a massive charge, but with a slow, creeping probe designed to test their defenses and their resolve. A faint whistling sound preceded the approach, a psychological tactic meant to unnerve them. Then came the shapes, shadowy figures moving low through the undergrowth, difficult to discern even in the faint pre-dawn light that filtered through the triple canopy. MacReady didn't wait for Rourke's command. He knew this was the moment of decision. If they allowed the probe to get close, they were overrun and executed. He clicked the safety off Clementine and squeezed the trigger. The resulting roar was the loudest sound in the valley, a terrifying, sustained burst of fire that lasted nearly 6 seconds, shaking the dew off the leaves in front of them. He walked the rounds into the densest section of the brush, listening not for screams, but for the sudden, definitive cessation of movement. The M-60 jumped violently in his hands, spitting out a massive volume of fire that turned the immediate jungle into mulch and smoke. He fired until the gun choked on the last round of the belt, the barrel already glowing hot again. He quickly performed the reload, slapping the next belt onto the tray, pulling the charging handle back. The response from the NVA was instantaneous and enraged. They unleashed their own machine guns and rifles, focusing on the muzzle flash, forcing MacReady and Rourke to duck low as splintered wood and dirt rained down. Hayes, galvanized by the sheer power of MacReady's defensive action, finally gripped his M-16 tightly, firing short, controlled bursts where he saw returning muzzle flashes. They held the line, but at a catastrophic cost to their remaining resources. MacReady had just burned through 2 belts in that one desperate exchange. He pulled back, breathing heavily, the heat radiating off Clementine intense enough to make the air around his head distort. He looked at the remaining boxes, 2 left, 200 rounds. It was the moment of truth. He looked at Rourke, whose eyes were wide with a mix of despair and awe. "That was the last major suppression we can lay, Sergeant. The next one is the push." Rourke looked at the 2 small, green metal boxes that represented their entire future. The concept of survival reduced to this tiny pile of brass was absurd. It forced the question we all face out here in the green hell, the question that haunts every soldier who has ever been cornered. When faced with certain death, Do you preserve your resources for a slight chance of retreat, or do you empty your magazine in a defiant, impossible rush for freedom? Do you sacrifice the quantity of life for the quality of the stand? What would you do when the last 2 boxes of ammunition stood between you and a massed enemy force? Share your perspective in the comments below, because in the jungle, these split-second moral decisions define who lives and who is remembered. For MacReady, the answer was already clear: total commitment to the assault. He was going to use those last 200 rounds to buy Hayes and Rourke a few precious seconds of open field. The remaining inventory was laid out meticulously on a poncho. 2 full M-60 belts, tightly linked and waiting. 2 fragmentation grenades, 1 standard issue, 1 a heavier, improvised anti-personnel device Rourke carried. Hayes's 3 M-16 magazines, and 3 flares, which Rourke dismissed as useless for signaling rescue but potentially useful for disorientation. The total firepower was laughable compared to the entrenched enemy. MacReady ignored the rifle rounds and grenades. His focus was only the M-60 rounds, 200 bullets, averaging about 2 seconds of continuous fire each. He looked at Rourke and stated the final plan, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. I'm going to load both belts together. I'll keep the first 75 rounds suppressed, walking them high. They'll duck. Then I transition to a sustained burst, walking the final 125 rounds low, right into the main firing aperture of their central bunker. That gives you and Hayes 4 seconds of guaranteed confusion. Hayes, who had been nervously cleaning his rifle, looked up, horrified. Mac, that's suicide. They'll have 3 or 4 rifles aimed at that aperture. MacReady gave him a hard, unflinching stare. I'm the only one with enough ammo to guarantee the break, and I'm the only one who can run the M-60 hot enough to make it count. You and Rourke are gonna pop smoke the second I start firing, roll out the back of this depression, and sprint right through the hole I make. Don't stop for anything. You run east, you find the river, you stick to the high ground. Rourke, a seasoned veteran of 2 tours, didn't argue the logic, only the outcome. We can try to draw their fire, cover you. MacReady shook his head vehemently. No, I need speed on your end. I'll be the distraction. When Clementine stops, that means the belt's empty. You'll have maybe 3 seconds after the last round before they recover. You have to be gone before then. I'm going to time the final burst so that the moment the last round leaves the barrel, Rourke throws the fragmentation grenade into the bunker aperture. The explosion covers your last second of movement. The sheer, cold practicality of the plan hung in the air, a testament to MacReady's transformation from a man to a mechanism. His life was now defined entirely by the effective delivery of the remaining brass. They spent the next 30 minutes coordinating the timing, the movements etched into their minds. Hayes would take point, Rourke would toss the grenade and follow, and MacReady would be the anchor, the temporary flaming shield. The sun was beginning to touch the highest canopy branches. They had less than an hour before the light became too strong, revealing their movements and making MacReady's rush impossible. The strangest thing happened in the lull before the inevitable confrontation. The psychological warfare began in earnest. The NVA, realizing their opponents were severely depleted and likely freezing in the early morning chill, started calling out. Not threats, but taunts mixed with surprisingly clear, American-accented Vietnamese. GIS, we know you are hurt. Drop the weapons. Come out. We have medical aid. The voice, amplified slightly, cut through the jungle sounds, unnerving them more than the mortar fire ever could. It sounded almost friendly, deceptively compassionate, highlighting the sheer hopelessness of their situation. Sergeant Rourke, we know your radio is broken. No one is coming for you. Save the boy. Rourke immediately understood the intent: to break their cohesion, to sow distrust and fear. MacReady ignored the voices completely, instead focusing on the meticulous process of linking the 2 remaining M-60 belts together with extreme care. He didn't want any hesitation, any hiccup in the feed tray when he needed maximum continuous output. He pressed the 2 belts together, the brass linking smoothly, creating one monstrous, continuous line of death, just under 200 rounds, snaking across the poncho like a golden serpent. Hayes, meanwhile, was fighting a silent battle against despair. The voice from the tree line, calm and reasonable, was chipping away at his will. "Why are we doing this, Mac? They sound like they just want us to stop fighting. If we surrender, they'll take us prisoner, right? We won't be hurt." MacReady stopped cleaning Clementine and looked at Hayes, the coldness in his eyes chilling. "Listen to me, Hayes. They haven't been shooting at us for 6 hours just to give us a cup of coffee and a cot. They need this bunker complex secret. They will execute us, painfully, and bury us in the mud. There are no prisoners in the A Shao Valley. There is only killing. You forget that voice. It's a lie. Your only truth is the steel in your hands and the distance you can cover when I start firing." The harshness snapped Hayes back to reality. Rourke took over, checking the safety pins on the grenades one last time. "Mac's right, son. We fight until we run out of ability to fight. We take this deal, we die on our knees. We take Mac's deal, we die running, and maybe, just maybe, one of us gets home to tell the tale. No more talk about surrendering." MacReady placed the massive, combined belt of ammunition carefully into the ammo box. Knowing this was the last time Clementine would ever feel full, he checked his sidearm, a rusty .45 caliber, and placed it within easy reach. The machine gunner was always the last one to fall, the final voice of defiance, and he needed a backup plan for when the big gun went silent. MacReady pushed himself into a half-crouch position, utilizing the only solid piece of cover in the hollow, a section of termite-ridden concrete foundation they had uncovered while digging in. He loaded the combined 200 rounds, running the strip over his shoulder and across his back, ready to feed the massive weapon. Rourke gave the signal, 3 rapid clicks from the radio's broken handset. It was the last agreed-upon signal. The silence that followed was suffocating, the air thick with anticipation, the smell of gunpowder still heavy from the pre-dawn exchange. MacReady placed his thumbs on the spade grip. He visualized the path. The tracer rounds needed to be walking right into the firing slit of the main NVA bunker, the one that had been giving them the most trouble. It wasn't about suppressing the tree line anymore. It was about destroying the linchpin of their defense. He took one deep, ragged breath, tasting the metallic tang of fear and determination. "Smoke! Now!" he roared, the command ripping out of his chest, not loud, but raw. Rourke simultaneously pulled the pins and lobbed the 2 smoke grenades, one white, one purple, toward the front of the depression. They landed and immediately began spitting out thick, disorienting clouds. The moment the smoke started to bloom, providing a momentary veil, MacReady threw the full weight of his shoulder into the M-60 and squeezed the trigger. The resulting burst wasn't just loud. It was tectonic. Clementine roared, a primal scream of desperation, burning through the rounds at a dizzying rate. MacReady held the trigger down, moving the gun in a tight, concentrated figure-8 pattern. The heat was instantaneous, the barrel going from hot to smoking within the first 70 rounds. He watched the tracers fly true, impacting the concrete lip of the bunker, chipping away the reinforced earth, and then, gloriously, stitching a continuous, blazing line right into the center of the aperture. The NVA fire immediately faltered, the bunker momentarily silenced by the sheer volume of metal entering the small space. "Go! Go!" MacReady screamed. His voice strained above the din. Rourke and Hayes scrambled out of the hollow, disappearing into the rolling smoke screen. Sprinting toward the hole MacReady had punched into the enemy's nerve center. MacReady kept the trigger depressed, the M-60 bucking and vibrating violently, the brass flying out in an endless stream. He could feel the resistance in the belt thinning, the pace increasing as the ammunition ran down. He wasn't firing a machine gun. He was conducting a funeral pyre for 200 bullets, sacrificing them for the slim hope of his squad mates' survival. His focus narrowed to the sound of the rounds, counting the rhythmic thump-thump-thump that signaled the end. The sound changed, suddenly and terrifyingly. The rhythm of the M-60, which had been a continuous, beautiful song of destruction, devolved into a sputtering cough, a desperate gasp for air. The brass casing, polished and heavy, stopped feeding. The bolt slammed home on an empty chamber. The gun had fired its last round. 200 bullets, gone in approximately 20 seconds of sustained, concentrated violence. MacReady's ears were completely deafened, the silence that followed the explosive barrage almost physically painful. He didn't wait. His training took over. He ripped the useless, smoking M-60 off the ground, leaving the now scorched barrel resting on the mud, and lunged forward, grabbing the last live fragmentation grenade from the dirt. He needed to execute his final move before the enemy realized the beast had run dry. He ran 5 staggering steps toward the bunker, momentum carrying his heavy frame. The NVA rifles, recovering from the shock, began to open up again, recognizing the break in the fire. Rounds zipped past him, chewing up the dirt where he had been lying. Rourke, who had reached the edge of the smoke screen, saw MacReady charging the bunker, the grenade held high. Rourke knew the timing was perfect. He tossed the second, heavier anti-personnel grenade right past MacReady, throwing it with all his strength, aiming for the aperture MacReady had carved open. MacReady, realizing Rourke had covered the exact spot, didn't hesitate. He took cover behind a small root ball just as Rourke's grenade detonated. Krakom. The explosion was immediate and tremendous, far louder and more devastating than the NVA mortars. It was a direct hit. The blast blew the front defenses of the bunker outward, showering the area with dirt, splinters, and body parts, confirming the tactical success of the maneuver. Hayes and Rourke, blinded by smoke and dust but driven by the thunderous chaos, used the momentary disarray to sprint into the jungle, diving over the trench lines that had been established just meters in front of their depression. MacReady lay still, listening to their crashing steps fade into the distance, counting the seconds until they were clear. He heard the panicked shouting of the NVA and the confused, heavy fire opening up haphazardly behind him, aimed at the fleeing shadows. He felt a sharp, burning pain in his leg. He had been hit, but the immediate threat was neutralized. He crawled into the bunker entrance, his .45 drawn, confirming the devastation. The interior was a charnel house. He retrieved the last live grenade he had carried and set a hasty, rudimentary booby trap inside the wrecked bunker, attaching the pin to a hanging wire. His mission was complete. He had bought them time. He now had to survive the impossible egress. The journey out was slow, excruciating hell. MacReady's left leg was pouring blood, making every step an exercise in agonizing endurance. He abandoned Clementine. The gun, now smoking and useless, was too heavy to carry through the dense jungle underbrush with a bum leg. Leaving his beloved M-60 felt like ripping off a limb, but it was necessary. The .45 was his only companion now. He followed the sound of the chaos he had created, moving laterally away from the epicenter of the blast, aiming vaguely toward the direction Rourke and Hayes had sprinted. The NVA were everywhere, their search patterns disorganized due to the confusion of the exploded bunker and the smoke screen, but they were closing fast. MacReady moved like a wounded, massive bear, crashing through the tangled vines, the sticky mud pulling at his boots. He relied entirely on the cover of the early morning shadows and the persistent noise of the jungle. He could hear voices, sharp and angry, closing in. He reached a small stream, barely a trickle, but enough to mask his scent and the sound of his movements. He submerged himself momentarily, letting the tepid, muddy water wash the worst of the grime and blood off, before struggling back onto the bank. The wound was bad, a clean shot through the thigh muscle, painful but not instantly debilitating. He tore a strip of fabric from his shredded fatigues and tied a hasty tourniquet, gritting his teeth against the white-hot flash of pain. He knew he couldn't keep this pace up for long. He needed to find high ground, a defensive position to make his final stand if Rourke and Hayes hadn't made it to the pre-designated extraction point. But as he crested a small ridge, he saw it. The distinctive, fresh boot prints of Rourke and Hayes, running side by side, heading precisely where they were supposed to. He allowed himself a brief, weary sigh of relief. The sacrifice of the 200 rounds hadn't been in vain. They were clear. Now it was just him,